I remember the moment when it's around that famous photo that everyone's looking around the screen, and you heard someone said something very quietly. And I remember, what did someone say? And they said, for EKIA, Geronimo, Geronimo. And of course, EKIA means an enemy killed in action. And that was the moment that the Operation Sets was successful.
We're talking about the end of Osama bin Laden. When you look back on that Operation Neptune's spear, how long was that process that got you in to that moment when bin Laden is killed?
It was a pretty exhaustive and extensive process. And I think it's a great example about how national security decision making should work. I mean, of the detailed meetings, it began in the fall of 2009, moving into really what became from an urgent time from February of the year Bin Laden operation happened right up until that May time. And I think the one thing that's important to realize, while all that was going on, that was far from the only piece of national security on President Obama's desk right now. This was in the middle of the Arab Spring. At one point, President Obama was traveling to Latin America. He had hosted the then Vice President, President Xi of China. So amongst all of those things, there was incredibly important operation going on, of course, in complete and utter secrecy.
And this is an extrajudicial killing. This is not you're not going in to arrest Osama bin Laden and bring him to justice. This is he's an enemy that you feel you have to take out. How much is that discussed even with the president as an option, as an ethical question, or is it considered? I mean, is that already taken as read that this is a guy that needs to be taken off the table?
Look, I think the overriding goal was three-part. First, it was to bring Osama bin Laden to justice and to stop him from doing more harm to innocent Americans and others around the world. Second was to make sure to do so in a way that minimized any casualties or loss of people who are innocent and had no part in this. And then third is to minimize the risk of our brave service members who carried out the operation. So I would say, to your direct question, there were discussions about how can you bring bin Laden to justice in the best way possible. If it would have been possible to bring him in and to take him as a prisoner, that was considered. There were legal discussions around that, exactly where he would be taken, of that would be done. But the overwhelming piece was, first, how do you bring him to justice? And then second, how do you do so to minimize the harm or loss of lives to others who were not plotting the terrorist attacks that he was?
And take us into that situation room then on the day. At what point do you think it? Tell us the timeline of it's on. The operation is happening. At what point do you bring the president in to witness it? Explain the sort of the choreography of an event like that.
Sure. I mean, it was a pretty dramatic set of events. I mean, I would even go back. There were weekly and often more than weekly meetings with the president, going far back in the Situation Room until February of 2011. As you got closer, the Thursday before the operation, the president brought his senior national security leaders into the Situation Room, went around and asked for a last time what the recommendation was for the meeting. And the thing you have to remember, that Saturday night was the White House Correspondents' Dinner. So much of the national security cabinet was in the press in a highly visible environment, of course, keeping things completely secretive. The morning of the operation, I think I remember getting into the White House early that morning. I think the cabinet, Secretary Gates, Secretary Clinton, and others gathered around 11 o'clock. And the president was supposed to arrive around 1 p.m. And that was supposed to be right before the operation itself was going on. So it was a pretty tense day, but everyone was there very focused on Sunday, waiting for things to go down.
And tell us the emotion. What is it like? Because I mean, there's a very, very small number of people in the world who will know what that feels like. That you're looking at screens. It must feel to a certain extent like you're in a movie, even though, of course, you know very clearly that you're not. What does it feel like? What's the sort of mood? What happens at the end? The feeling of it, I think it must be extraordinary.
It's a really great question. I mean, of course, walking in that day, there's a tremendous sense of expectation. I mean, what you have to remember is this was a process that was incredibly well planned, and the Navy SEALs and the operators out there had launched very dangerous and successful operations hundreds and thousands of times in Iraq and Afghanistan. But the mood as you get in, extremely focused, very disciplined. I remember the moment when it's around that famous photo that everyone's looking around the screen, and you heard someone said something very quietly. And I remember, what did someone say? and they said for EKIA, Geronimo, Geronimo. And of course, EKI means an enemy killed in action. And that was the moment you know that the Operation Sets was successful. And people often ask, well, what happened there? Was there applause? Was it like a scene out of a movie? And it really was very much the opposite. There was a quiet sense of, okay, we got him. But what you have to remember is the service members were still in Pakistani airspace. They were still in the Abbottabad compound, and they still had to fly in the helicopter to get out of Pakistan, back into Afghanistan, back to Bagram Air Force Base. So there wasn't some moment of jubilation. It really was a sense of the first step is gone. Now that we brought bin Laden to justice, let's get the evidence we can about any other plotting that he's doing to save more lives, but let's make sure that we can get our service members out of harm's way. So only when that happened was there a sense of relief that the important part of the operation was over. It didn't happen at that moment that everyone sees in that now famous photograph.
And when did you know? How long did it take them to get out? So when did you know the operation, we can stick a pin in it, this has been a success because our guys are out?
You know, there were two parts of it. I think probably it was about an hour and a half to get out when you could cross out of the Pakistani airspace. But then, very famously, the question is this bin Laden?
Yeah.
So, if you look at the photos, which they later shared, which were not released to the public, it obviously looks like Osama bin Laden. He was the right height. If you probably saw his body as the operators did, there was very little doubt. But there was a decision at the time to say, well, do you need to wait for a DNA test? You know, there was some DNA available based on other relatives that we knew, and that probably was the final confirmation. What ended up happening that evening is there were some reports on Twitter that something had happened in Pakistan. Of course, this was late at night in Washington, D.C. I think it was around 9 or 10 at night. And rather than waiting until the morning, which would have been evening Pakistan time, and in the morning in Washington time and Monday, rather than letting all that could have happened with Twitter go on, the decision was made to go in and actually announce to the country that this was done. Of course, it was bin Laden, but there was some of a risk because the DNA test hadn't come in yet. Even though I think anyone seeing him, it looked exactly like Osama bin Laden, and obviously it turned out to be him.
And that didn't solve the problem, did it? I mean, what's interesting about al-qaeda, what was terrifying about it for that period, and still potentially now, is that bin Laden leads on to Zawahiri, and so he gets off last year, and then there's someone else now, and that's the risk, isn't it? That you're cutting off one head of the Hydra, but the Hydra survives.
I mean, look, I think President Obama in his speech made clear is this was an important step, an important victory, but it's not the war. And you need to remain diligent and you need to remain focused. I mean, as you said, bin Laden obviously commanded a lot of operational control. He had a huge following. There was so much to do, but you couldn't stop then. So I think the piece was this is critically important and brought someone who had killed so many people to justice, but we can't stop there. And frankly, that's even true now. I mean, we face a dilemma is how do you use the right amount of resources and the right risk to American and British and other allied service members to go after these people without launching a very expensive and ongoing war, but doing exactly what we can to do. So it's one step, it's an important step, but far from the only one.
And I do come back to this ethical question, Max. I am interested in it, we live in a society where we say we believe in the rule of law. We believe in a justice system by which people are tried. People are taken, they're arrested, there's habeas corpus, they can be brought forth in front of a judge, and they are tried, and there is a process. And yet there is this parallel thing that exists in a war, even if it's not a front war like Ukraine, in a war on terror, where we are saying effectively, no, the president has this godlike power to point out some people who can get taken out. And we know that sometimes goes wrong. We know there's collateral damage. We know that sometimes mistakes are made, the wrong people are taken. How much does that sit comfortably with you? Is this, I mean, or is that a sort of naive question? Actually, the ethics of this are perfectly clear to you.
No, I think, look, the reality on a battlefield is very different from reality in a courtroom. I mean, all of us in that room, President Obama was a lawyer. I'm a lawyer. We had legal counsel there talking about the international law, domestic law. That was a critical piece of the discussion. And that was part of all the planning. And the discussion was ultimately, if you are on the battlefield and someone is about to shoot at you, you don't have time to question them on the witness stand. That someone has brought a lot of harm. You have identified it's the right person. And the direction was for the Navy SEALs who put themselves in harm's way to go after him. If you are threatened, you can defend yourself. And as we know from what happened later, the reports that he had a weapon, those were around them. And when someone is trying to attack you, that what was done. But the idea that it was an operation just to, at any cost, take someone's life without trying to do something more was not true. There was a contingency plan to think about what can be done, but you need to be realistic about what happens on the battlefield, not if it's someone like Osama bin Laden, but what really goes on there.
Yeah. And just finally, Matt, that Sunday evening, what do you when you go home at night? What do you think? What's your feeling?
It was interesting. I remember, we had been there working a huge amount of time the entire weekend, months and months before, and the president finished his speech. Some of us went into the press secretary's office, and there was a briefing of the press about the timeline and what happened. And we learned inside the White House that a group of not protesters, but people celebrating had gathered around the White House. And what that meant, though, is the White House went into lockdown. So we were in the White House until about 1 in the morning, had very little sleep. And finally, at about 1:30, when I finally walked out the Northwest Gate, I remember I was pretty tired looking. And someone carrying the sign saying, like, "Go USA," came up to me and he said, what's wrong with you? Why do you look so quiet? I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Don't you know, man? We just got Osama bin Laden." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, that's something pretty amazing." And then I went home, got about 4 hours of sleep, got up, and we showed up the next day early in the morning because we had a whole plate of other national security issues to deal with. There was China, there was cyber warfare, there was Middle East policy, there was the Arab Spring. So it's not like we stopped. It was just one step. And it was an amazing moment for the United States and I think those who are fighting al-qaeda, but it was far from the end of the story. It was just another step in a really complicated road ahead.
And you didn't tell that guy. I was in the incident. I was in the situation room. I was there. I was part of it.
I think I just need to get some
Yeah.
sleep.